the Buddha is the unsurpassable teacher. That's one of the qualities that we can recollect and remember about him. So we chant Itipiso Bhagava Arahang Samma Sambuddho Vijja Charana Sampanno Sugato Loka Vidu. Then we also chant anuttaro purisadamma sārathi and sattha deva manusanang. So anuttaro purisadamma sārathi would be the unsurpassable trainer of trainable people. Literally, I think that would be the most literal translation. And then the sattha deva manusanang, the teacher or master of humans and gods or divine beings. But what does this actually mean? This little word. It's just one word. So what does this actually mean? What kind of significance does it have in terms of the qualities of the Buddha? So one can recollect different aspects of the Buddha's unsurpassable teacher. How does the Buddha teach? Where does his instruction lead? Then what qualities make the Buddha the unsurpassable teacher? And also how successful was the Buddha as teacher? And what did he achieve by his teaching efforts? The way the Buddha is teaching is that he invites you. He says, come and see for yourself. And in another sutta, in Majjhima Nikāya 80, he says, may a wise person come to me, one who is honest, sincere and upright. I will instruct him, I will teach him the Dhamma in such a way that if he practices as instructed, he will soon know and see for himself. In this way, one will wisely be liberated from bondage, namely from the bondage of ignorance. So the teaching of the Buddha, or the way he teaches, is that he invites people to come and see, in the sense that they, by applying his teaching, that they become seeing themselves. Most religions are belief systems, and their most important quality is faith. I think often the word religion and faith are almost synonymous. So I think if most people think about religion, then they ask you, what do you believe? So basically religion is about believing something. I think that's often what people associate with religion. While Buddhism presents you with a different idea of what a religion might be. And the Buddha himself called his teaching a training, a way of inner development. And so this is the training of higher virtue or morality, the training of the higher mind or heart, and the training in wisdom. By applying this training, then that will lead you to true knowledge and liberation. So it's a different thing than just believing something, but you have to practice to apply something, and then as a result you will realize the truth yourself. And so the Buddha says that by practicing this inner development, that this will lead you from disturbance to silence and peace, and from defilement to purity, and from confusion to more and more clarity, to become seeing yourself and then realize the truth yourself. And the main beliefs that you have to accept if you want to practice the teaching of the Buddha is that human beings have this capacity to realize liberation by their own skillful effort. Also that human beings have the capacity to cultivate beneficial and ennobling qualities and mind states. And that humans have the capacity to abandon harmful qualities and mind states. So I can already see by these basic assumptions that the teaching of the Buddha is not just a faith that you have to believe in, but you have to put it to the test. Can you do it? Is that really possible? And how can you do that? And so you read and hear about the teaching of the Buddha, have some confidence in it, and remember it, keep it in mind. You investigate its meaning, how it relates to your life and your mind, and you apply your efforts to align your actions and your mind with what the Buddha is teaching. Some things that the Buddha is teaching, they are far beyond direct experience of an ordinary person. But if you apply the training of the Buddha, then you will gradually expand your range of knowledge and direct experience. So because you become a different being and your mind becomes different, you are gradually able to see more and more clearly and see the truth on a more and more profound level. And the Buddha also says, if you apply this teaching, then you can see what you've never seen before, and you can realize what you've never realized before. And that wisdom and knowledge that arises as a result is based on inner development, because the clear mind or heart can see things as they really are. And the Buddha also says that this knowledge will be independent of faith, independent of tradition, independent of personal preferences and approval, and it also will not be dependent just on reflection or thinking something out. So by applying this training, by practicing this way of inner development, the Buddha gradually leads you further and further to independence and becoming a person who is capable of seeing himself and more responsible and not getting into trouble, or in the sense a person who less and less harms himself and others, and a person who has more and more peace. And the Buddha teaches that one can verify his teaching completely and then see the same timeless law of causality, the same truth, the same law of nature that the Buddha and his great disciples already realized. And the Buddha also talks about what is the purpose of his teaching and instruction. He says, this is the purpose of speech. This is the purpose of discussion. This is the purpose of listening. The liberation of the mind by non-clinging. So there's a larger framework, what the Buddha says, why did he teach and why did he give all this instruction at various levels, from more basic to more and more profound. It was all directed towards the liberation of the mind by non-clinging to liberation. What qualities did the Buddha have that made him the unsurpassable teacher? On the one hand, his realization of truth, his spiritual attainments. On the other hand, also his supreme teaching abilities. And they are expressed in the 10 powers of a Tathagata, of a Buddha. And the Buddha says, because he has these 10 powers, he claims the place as the leader of the herd. He roars the lion's roar in the assemblies, and he sets in motion the highest Dhamma wheel. And so these are the reasons why he, in accordance with the Dhamma, has this place as unsurpassable teacher. The Buddha has fully understood, as it actually is, the cosmos with its manifold and diverse elements. So by his direct knowledge with samadhi of a unified, developed mind, he has fully understood all conditioned phenomena and the law of causality. Yeah, and because of that, the Buddha also knows what is possible and impossible. So sometimes the Buddha says in some discourses that something is impossible. And then this is actually a categorical statement. So this is not just his opinion, but this is based on his knowledge of the nature of the universe. By his awakening, the Buddha also has fully understood all defilements or qualities that obstruct liberation and how they can be abandoned. And he has also fully understood all qualities that lead to awakening and how they can be developed, and all meditative and spiritual attainments. He also fully understood, as it actually is, the results of actions undertaken, so of karma, and of past, future and present, by the ways of possibilities and causes. He has fully understood, as they actually are, the ways leading to all destinations. So he understands the actions that lead to all forms of rebirth and how this happens. Based on his development of samadhi, he also remembered his previous lives with their aspects and particulars. And based on his development of samadhi, he sees with the divine eye how beings are reborn and pass away according to their karma, according to their actions. And then, most important, he has realized the knowledge of the destruction of the taints. So he realized the Four Noble Truths and completed the tasks. So in the sense that he has fully understood suffering, and he has abandoned the origin of suffering. He realized the cessation of suffering, liberation, and he developed the path leading to the cessation of suffering. And because of this understanding, he also knew that any potential of suffering and any defilement cannot possibly arise anymore in his mind. So they have been irreversibly eliminated, and that complete liberation has been realized. So that would be a very short overview of the realization of the truth that makes the Buddha the unsurpassable teacher. And then there's the other aspect, the teaching ability of the Buddha. And based on his developed mind, the Buddha had the ability to read the mind of other beings, their thoughts, but also to recognize their emotions, or to what level the mind has been developed. In addition to that, the Buddha also understood, as they really are, the different inclinations and faculties of beings. So what kind of capabilities do beings have or people have? What do they understand easily, what's more difficult? And that enabled him to specifically teach according to the capabilities of different people, so that they make the best possible progress. The Buddha also had what is called the four analytical knowledges completely. The analytical knowledge of meaning, of the Dhamma, of language and discernment. In the discourses they are not explained in detail, but my understanding would be that by these knowledges he was able to perceive his mind and his mind states in great detail and how they work, and then also understanding his realization and different spiritual attainments in great detail. And also he was able to explain them, then expressed it in language to people, so that people would understand it easily. And so, for example, then the result is that you can give some teaching just summarize something in 4 verse lines, or talk about it for 2 hours without any difficulty. You can just, whatever level of explanation you want to give, whether it's short, very short, or long or very long, then one is able to give this explanation of some fact, of some truth. This ability to explain things in language and to teach is not necessarily something that comes with awakening. And it's not necessary. If you want to realize awakening, you don't have to be good at talking or teaching. So some around disciples, some awakened disciples of the Buddha, they were rather quiet and they gave only short teachings and were not so effective in teaching, and others were very good at it. So the supreme teaching ability of the Buddha is something special that only a Buddha has. A nice little story to give an example is from Majjhima Nikaya 58. Prince Abhaya, he's one of the sons of King Bimbisara of Magadha. He visits the Buddha, and at the end of the conversation with the Buddha, he asks him, if people come to visit the Buddha and ask him a question, does the Buddha beforehand already think out, if they ask me like this, then I will answer like that, and if they ask me like that, I will answer like this. So does the Buddha sort of think out what they will answer before, or does the Buddha just answer immediately, sort of on the spot? And the Buddha then asks the prince a counter question. So he asks him, are you skilled in all parts of a chariot? Do you know all parts of a chariot? And the prince says, yes, I'm an experienced charioteer. I know all the parts of a chariot. And so if people come to ask you about a chariot, do you think out beforehand what you will explain to them? Or can you just explain it immediately? And the prince said, yeah, well, I know everything already about it, so I can just answer immediately. So the Buddha then answers similarly. He says, in just the same way, when people come to ask him, then he can just answer immediately, because the element of the Dhamma, the nature of things, has been fully realized by the Buddha, and so he can just answer immediately, spontaneously. Additionally to his great teaching ability, the Buddha was also the greatest poet in history, at least in terms of the profoundness of meaning. Probably in terms of the poetry style, one can probably debate what kind of poetry style is more beautiful or something like that, but in terms of poetry that explains profound meaning, then I would claim that. In the suttas, in the discourses of the Buddha, there were several thousand verses of the Buddha. Yeah, because the Buddha could easily just make up spontaneous verses. And poetry is a very suitable way of expressing the meaning. And the poetry can stir you up or inspire you, and it's also, very good to express things which are lofty and profound. And so poetry also can trigger emotions, and it's also easy to remember. So it has many benefits to teach in poetry, in verse. And because of that, it's easy to see why the Buddha would often teach in verse. So for example, sometimes the Buddha would see an inspiring monk, or he would see a foolish person doing something, and then he would just spontaneously speak an inspired utterance. So just when he saw that, he would just express some meaning about that, what happened, to teach. Or sometimes he would just summarize a teaching in verse to make it more memorable. Today we live in a rather prosaic age where people just write these short messages with the smartphone, which are sort of more or less correct grammar, And so it's maybe difficult to imagine how someone can make up dozens of verses just spontaneously. But yeah, also a few hundred years ago in England, it was actually quite common to express strong feelings and emotions with verses. So yeah, if people are sad or experience some great joy, then they would just feel inspired to say something in verse. Like today, this doesn't happen anymore. So it's more just very ordinary in our age. There's one example where one can see that. Often if Brahmins go to visit a great, let's say if Brahmins would go to visit a great spiritual teacher like the Buddha, then they would obviously not talk with him in a casual way. But for talking with a great spiritual teacher, they felt only expressing something in verse would be appropriate and lofty enough to basically to communicate with this teacher. And so you can see many occasions in the suttas where Brahmins visit the Buddha and then they just spontaneously make up some verse and ask him some question, and the Buddha is answering in verse. The Brahmins were often very skilled in language, so they also were good in making up some spontaneous verses. Also devas, divine beings, they usually come to visit the Buddha and ask him questions in verses as well. So they are lofty beings and then they communicate in lofty language. Yeah, sometimes also monks would do that. So let's say sometimes the Buddha would teach a large gathering of monks, maybe 500, 1,000 monks. And then Venerable Vangisa, the monk who was the foremost poet in the Sangha, he would just get up spontaneously from his seat and say to the Buddha, "Some inspiration occurs to me, Blessed One." And so then he would speak some spontaneous verses to capture the atmosphere of the occasion. Two short little descriptions how the Buddha was teaching from Majjhima Nikaya 91 and 77. So when the Buddha has gone to the monastery, he teaches the Dhamma to an audience. He neither flatters nor berates the audience. He instructs, urges, rouses, and encourages it with a talk purely on the Dhamma. The speech that issues from his mouth has 8 qualities. It is clear, distinct, charming, audible, pleasant to hear, full, sonorous, deep and resonant. But while his voice is intelligible as far as the audience extends, his speech does not issue out beyond the audience. When the people have been instructed, urged, roused and encouraged by him, they rise from their seats and depart, looking only at him, concerned with nothing else. Or then another example. Some said the recluse Gotama is the head of an order, the head of a group, the teacher of a group, the well-known and famous founder of a sect regarded by many as a saint. He is honored, respected, revered and venerated by his disciples. And his disciples live in dependence on him, honoring him and respecting him. Once the recluse Gotama was teaching his Dhamma to an assembly of several hundred followers. And then a certain disciple of his cleared his throat. Thereupon one of his companions in the holy life nudged him with the knee to indicate, "Be quiet, Venerable Sir, make no noise. The Blessed One, the teacher, is teaching the Dhamma." When the recluse Gotama is teaching the Dhamma to an assembly of several hundred followers, on that occasion there is no sound of his disciples coughing or clearing their throats. But then that large assembly is waiting with great waiting in expectancy. Let us hear the Dhamma that the Blessed One is about to teach. Just as though a man would stand at a crossroad, pressing out pure honey, and a large group of people would be standing there and expecting something to happen. So too, when the recluse Gautama is teaching the Dhamma to an assembly of several hundred followers. So then they are just very focused on the Dhamma and listening to that. And the Buddha was usually explaining things, his teaching in a progressive way, in a gradual way. So he started with something on a level that the person was able to understand, and then based on that he would lead the person gradually to higher and higher spiritual qualities. And he explained things with reason and talked out of sympathy and not for the sake of material things or to harm or criticize others. The Buddha also says that listening to Dhamma has a unique effect. The Buddha says when someone is listening to the Dhamma with eager ears, directing his whole mind to it, then on that occasion the 5 hindrances can get abandoned and the 7 enlightenment factors can get developed. So he says then that a person can gain inspiration in the meaning, inspiration in the Dhamma. Because of that, joy arises and other samadhi qualities. And so the Buddha would use his teaching, use that to elevate the mind of his listeners further and further until their hearts were ready and receptive, free from hindrances, elated and confident. And then he would explain the teaching that is unique to the Buddhas, to them, the Four Noble Truths. And because their hearts were already elevated and purer by listening to the Dhamma, they were then able to realize the Four Noble Truths while they were listening and realized one of the stages of awakening. And the Buddha calls this the miracle of instruction. So this is something marvelous that you can elevate the mind of a person by teaching them and leading them in this way to the same realization of the truth that you have realized yourself. And the Buddha also says that this is the greatest miracle. So greater and more beneficial than the miracle of psychic powers and mind reading is the miracle of instruction. This possibility to use teaching, talking, to elevate the mind of other people and lead them to liberation. And that's also why the Buddha calls the Dhamma, his teaching, the unsurpassable sound. And he says this is the unsurpassable sound that leads to the purification of beings, to the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, to the realization of Nibbana. And so this is something special. And so sometimes you can read some examples, sometimes even just because of the powerful impact of the teaching of the Buddha, people's physical appearance actually changed. They looked so much brighter and more radiant after they had listened to a teaching of the Buddha, because it just elevated the mind so much. And so this is then this miracle of instruction, in a sense that having this benefit of leading people to a beneficial mind state or even to liberation. Because of the powerful effects that the Buddha's teaching ability had on other people, then some religious teachers started to believe that it was some magician who knows some conversion magic to lure away the disciples of other teachers. So it's mentioned in several discourses. Let's say, for example, Ninganta Nataputto sends a lay disciple to the Buddha And then another disciple of Ningantana, the Buddha, says, don't send this disciple to the Buddha. He knows some conversion magic to convert the people of other religions. So he's already worried. But then he says, no, it's impossible. He can go there. But it happens then differently than he thinks. So, yeah. Yeah, but in reality, the Buddha didn't work some black conversion magic to get lots of disciples and get lots of fame. But yeah, his motivation to teach Dhamma was completely different. He this efforts, that all this effort that the Buddha made to teach others was an expression of his supreme compassion, his wish that other beings may be free from suffering and may realize the same liberation that he realized already. Because of that, the Buddha also says that a perfectly awakened one is the one being that arises out of compassion for the world. So, out of a large mission or a large purpose, that a being arises out of compassion for the whole world, the whole universe. And he taught with the intention, may they listen to the Dhamma. Having listened, may they understand the Dhamma. Having understood the Dhamma, may they practice in accordance with the Dhamma. He teaches the Dhamma to others because of the intrinsic excellence of the Dhamma, out of compassion and sympathy, out of tender concern. And the Buddha also saw himself as noble friend of all beings, you could say as a noble friend of the world. So he expresses this very nicely in Sangha Nikaya 45, number 2. By relying on me, the Buddha, as a noble friend, being subject to birth, are freed from birth, being subject to aging, are freed from aging, being subject to death, are freed from death, being subject to sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair, are freed from sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. By this method, Ananda, it may be understood that the entire holy life is noble friendship. So yeah, the Buddha is like a friend, and if other beings come to him as their noble friends, then he can teach them the path to liberation, and they can realize it. And then the last aspect of the Buddha as unsurpassable teacher is how successful was the Buddha as teacher, and what did he achieve by teaching. So one could give a nice simile for that. Just like the sun is not only bright and radiant for itself, but it also provides the energy for the entire ecosystem of planet Earth and for all beings. So too, in the same way, the Buddha did not only realize awakening for himself, but sort of illuminated the lives of countless beings and led them to liberation. For us, that's more or less clear, but some people who don't know that much about the teaching of the Buddha, they might ask, did people actually understand what the Buddha was teaching when he was alive, and to what extent? So, for example, more than 10 years ago, when I was visiting my home country, then so it was just more like newly ordained, maybe Samanera or New Bhikkhu, and then I talked with a few of my cousins, and so explaining them a little bit of the purpose of monk's life, and that the purpose of it is to develop the Noble Eightfold Path, and the idea is to realize the same awakening that the Buddha himself realized. And then one of them asked me whether anyone else than the Buddha ever realized awakening. Because, I mean, I think in many other religions it would be, say, unthinkable that a disciple has the same spiritual attainment like the founder of the religion. It would just be something like presumptuous or seen as something inappropriate. While, the Buddha often says that then the Arahants, they've realized the same liberation that he has already realized. And so she was surprised to hear that not only one or two people realized awakening, but the same spiritual attainment that the Buddha realized, but several thousand already during the time when he was alive, when he was still teaching. And additionally, at least several 10,000 people realized the first stage of awakening, stream entry, so they had the certainty that they would realize the ultimate goal. And so among these thousands of Arahants and 10,000 of noble disciples, the Buddha mentions additionally then 41 monks, 30 nuns, and 20 male and female lay disciples as special great disciples with some even more outstanding qualities, and encourages us to emulate them. And so some of his disciples, they were foremost in wisdom or psychic powers, like Venerable Mammogalana or Venerable Sariputta, or Sister Upalavana or Sister Kema. Some of them were foremost in memory and mindfulness, like Venerable Ananda. Some were outstanding in deep meditation, like the half-sister of the Buddha, Sister Nanda, or Nanda Mata, one of the female lay disciples. Some were great teachers, like Venerable Puna, Sister Dhammadina, or the male lay disciple Chitta. Some were foremost in generosity, like Anathapindika or Visakha. So one can go on even beyond this just 1,000 Arahants. There are all these special, even more special disciples as well. And the Buddha gives a nice simile for that. In the ocean, there are various great beings like blue whales and humpback whales and whale sharks and so on. And so the Buddha says similar, just like the ocean is the abode of great beings, so too the dispensation of the Buddha is the abode of great beings. The stream enterer and the one on the path to stream entry, and the once returner and the non-returner, and the Arahants and those on the path to these attainments. When the Buddha realized awakening, he was only 35 years old. Because of that, he was able to teach people from all levels of society, and from kings, rich bankers, or Brahmins, to outcast people, all levels of society. The Buddha says that he even teaches some simple hunters or food carriers respectfully, because of his respect to the Dhamma. So whatever kind of social status this person would have, or what kind of whatever miserable existence, he would still teach them respectfully, because the Dhamma is something special, and so he wants to teach them as good as possible. Whether they're rich or poor, or whether they are of a high status or low status, it doesn't matter, because they have this possibility to realize liberation. Because the Buddha was teaching for 45 years, he would explain the path to awakening in all details and from various angles. He could also correct monks and other people who misunderstood his teaching. Because of that, he didn't just leave behind a few short sayings that were made into some system by later generation of disciples. But he created a living apprenticeship devoted to develop the path to awakening. He established a large collection of teachings, a monastic order with a complete structure of rules and protocols, the Dhamma and Vinaya. And the purpose of that is that his teaching would last a long time, so that future generations could follow the path to awakening for many millennia. And already during the 45 years when the Buddha was teaching, monks and nuns would already specialize to memorize his teaching and the Vinaya and regularly meet and recite it together. At the end of his life, when the Buddha was 80, he had taught so extensively and he was understood so well by his disciples that he didn't appoint a person, a successor, but the Dhamma and Vinaya, his teaching and the monastic discipline. His personal presence was not necessary anymore, and that he just taught the way of practice, a method, and as long as this teaching and this way of practice was transmitted to the next generation, then it could continue and people can apply the teaching, the Dhamma, and realize it. So his personal presence is not necessary for that. Yeah, this training, the Dhamma and Vinaya that the Buddha established, it lasted longer than the Roman Empire or the dynasties of the pharaohs, and it still exists today, and we have this possibility to practice it and realize it. Just like the ocean contains various precious things like pearls and various gems, so too we have these Dhamma gems of the teaching of the Buddha, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and the Noble Eightfold Path, and the 4 right efforts, the 5 faculties, and so on. It's another simile that the Buddha gives. Yeah, even though the Buddha had a supreme teaching ability, he wasn't hoping to save all beings. Instead, he focused on teaching those who actually were most receptive and could be taught. That was the result of his complete understanding of karma. Not everyone who heard his teaching had the right combination of past and present karma and the right mind state to be open to understand it. And the Buddha also says that he's just like a person who is pointing out the way. So let's say there's a person telling you this is the way you can go to Brisbane, and so then if the person follows it correctly, then the person will end up in Brisbane, but if he goes another way, then he will end up another way. Or if he's not following it, if he decides to go somewhere else, then he will end up somewhere else. So similar to Buddha, then he also gets asked, why do some people realize liberation that is teaching and some not? Then he says it's just like someone was pointing out the way, and then the individual people have to practice his teaching and walk this way, develop this path, and then so that they can arrive at a destination, at Nibbana, realize the teaching themselves. And so if they either apply it wrongly or decide not to follow it, then it is their decision and they will end up somewhere else then naturally as a result of that. Yeah, the Buddha had to relate to different people in a very different way, according to their capacity. So the Buddha already said that before he started to teach, he saw with the eyes of a Buddha that there are beings who are easy to teach and difficult to teach. So you can see many different examples in the suttas and the Vinaya, where the Buddha is teaching, and you can see his teaching skill in action. So either maybe sometimes just teaching a person some short teaching and he already realizes awakening. And in other cases, people who are visiting him, who are abusing him, or are trying to defeat him in a debate, or they don't follow his instructions, they're sort of stubborn, and then seeing how the Buddha relates to them. And thus basically, trying to establish them in what is wholesome and to encourage them not to do what is unwholesome. Yeah, so a nice example, practical example of the Buddha's teaching skill. Imagine you would have to live by a code of law from 500 BC. Would be probably rather weird to live according to a law of 500 from the time of 500 BC. But yeah, so I've been living now by a code of law from 500 BC more than 10 years. And the Vinaya, the monastic discipline, and it actually works still very well, even in this age, because it was made by a perfectly awakened one. So it can still be applied. And most things that are described, they are also relevant today. The Buddha encourages us to investigate and examine the qualities of the Buddha ourselves, to investigate the teaching. That's an opportunity to get a glimpse of the Buddha's wisdom. So the Buddha says this in some discourses. If you engage in discussion with someone or hear the teaching of someone, you can see his wisdom indirectly to some extent, as fast as possible from outside. But to really see and experience it yourself, you have to apply and practice his teaching yourself. And yeah, in this way, then you can see for yourself that the Buddha is the unsurpassable teacher and he leads actually to awakening. So at the end, a short quote that the Buddha sometimes speaks at the end of a discourse. Then, for example, he says something like, "Monks, I've taught you Nibbana and the path leading to Nibbana. Whatever should be done by a compassionate teacher out of compassion for his disciples, who desires their welfare, that I have done for you." So yeah, he says basically, whatever a compassionate teacher can do for you, I have done it for you. And then he says, here are roots of trees, here are empty huts. Meditate, monks, don't be heedless, don't regret it later. This is my instruction for you. So yeah, the Buddha pointing to the fact that he basically did everything for his disciples that he could have done, and trying to help them to realize liberation and to benefit them. And now it's up to us to apply it and see that it really leads where the Buddha is teaching, is promising that it will lead. Yeah, so both ways one can get an impression of the Buddha's unsurpassable teacher by reading his Dhamma, by getting an overview of his teaching and how he teaches people, but then also obviously more profoundly by practicing and applying the teaching yourself in a way that's always the more profound one. Nip asked about it just a few days ago. So in a way, one thing is to see the Buddha's teaching skill, but then obviously more important even than to apply it and practice it, so that you actually see the Dhamma for yourself, or at least get some experience that it is a method that works and leads in the right direction. And that is obviously the most convincing thing. Then the other thing you can always sort of then doubt, however beautifully explained some teaching is. At the end, if you haven't really tested it or realized it, then it always remains uncertain. But then if you realize it yourself, then you can see it for yourself. Yes?
This is just a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I think the teaching,
Mm-hmm.
from what
Yeah, exactly. That's also why basically, I think that's one of the elements that it's also described as of rouses and fires and of inspires the people. So in the sense that this already gives this image that he tries to teach them in a way that actually makes them live differently, or that makes them do something differently, or think about their life differently, and basically trying to motivate them to apply his teaching. While that's also why he then gives this, let's say, similes to stir people up or inspire people, and because why he more or less, I would say, almost one of the main purposes why the Buddha is teaching is that he tries to stir up a sense of samvega and pasada in people. So he tries to stir up a sense of urgency to apply his teaching and practice it. And on the other hand, pasada, a sense of confidence or brightness or inspiration. This is really worthwhile to do, and that's so important. And I should do that, and I want to do that. This is a sense of pasada, and that's more or less, this is, I would say, the more or less the main purpose to stir up these two emotions in people. And apart from giving this factual information, which can be easily read or somehow got by somewhere, but then, so this is, would say, a main difference then. But then also, obviously, it's also difficult depending on how well you know the person, and how actually to what extent can you actually stir the people up without sort of scaring them too much, or to say, for example, or what is sort of in the range of their capability, for example. So let's say with some people he would teach them differently than with other people, and he could teach them in a more radical way than others. While then, if you would see that the mind is not yet elevated so much, then they would just give more basic teachings. In another case, he would just give some very more like radical teachings. And so that's the word better you know a person, the more easy you can give something specifically which is inspiring to the person. While if you don't know the person so well, then you can say some general things, but then that is my experience so far with teaching, with the little experience I have. But that basically, depending on how well you know a person, and not only just knowing the person in a sense of where does the person come from, or whatever their history, but more in the sense of what is inspiring to the person, or let's say, what is the person actually doing in terms of Dhamma practice, or how is the person practicing in meditation. And then if you know more about that, you can say something more specific, or the more you know about that, the more specific you can say something. And so also when I talk with my mother, actually she's actually talking more than I am talking, so actually mostly the purpose is to retrieve information about her mind, and then sometimes I say something when something comes to mind, but then mostly actually she's, let's say if we talk, then she's actually talking more than I'm talking. I think maybe 2/3, more than half she's talking, and then then sometimes if something comes to mind, I also say something, and basically more or less gathering this information and then see what kind of input I can give, so that the mind gets more wholesome. And well, otherwise, you can just give something general, sort of what's from this whole range that the Buddha was teaching from. It's just that one. More or less, the idea is that you can. The Buddha says that his teaching is only one taste, the taste of liberation. So, in the sense that you, by applying some part of it, you gain some taste of the benefits of the Dhamma, and by that you get more interested to apply it more and more. And that's his approach of teaching, that you gain first some benefit and then higher and higher benefits. And that's generally how he teaches. And that one can actually, there's also this, in terms of not just, let's say, getting this intellectual information, but actually experiencing that you can become different, or that your life can become different, and if you apply it, and so that it leads sort of to a different way of life, different mind state, becoming a different person, and yeah.
Because oftentimes we think about practice as just
Mm. Mm. Yeah, just also then, what is a practical way of practicing, like say, non-clinging or teaching of non-self? So in the sense that you basically, if you, that you can actually experience that the cessation of clinging or the not appropriating something can lead to happiness. That you maybe, if you give something to someone and then you're actually happy, that you give a gift to someone and the person is happy and you're just happy along with the other person. And then, so basically seeing that actually giving up something, basically not appropriating something, the cessation of clinging is actually leading to happiness in a practical way, rather than just a concept that one should give up all clinging or see everything as non-self. And then that one can experience that they're actually appropriating something as mine is actually leading to affliction, and then the abandoning that can lead to something different, to something that is more vast or more peaceful. And so from this more basic thing that one, let's say, gives something materially, to then more and more fundamental things gradually. So yeah.